Good afternoon. Hola. I'm delighted to welcome you to the European Accounting Review Symposium on Textual Analysis Research in Accounting. As many of you may know, the next special issue of the EAR is going to be dedicated to textual analysis research in accounting. And the deadline, I'm going to talk about it later in our presentation. In addition, as some of you may know, Hervé Stoloui, the chief editor of EAR, kindly asked myself and Florin Vasvari from London Business School to serve as the guest editors for the special issue, and we were delighted and honored to accept the invitation. So today is going to be, this next hour and a half are going to be devoted to talk a little bit about textual analysis research in accounting. The plan is to have each of the three distinguished panelists and myself talk for about 15 minutes or so about their experiences, their thoughts, their views about where textual analysis is right now and where it's actually, I don't know exactly what they're going to talk about, but I assume that's going to be the context of their discussion, about 15 to 20 minutes, and I'm going to also share my thoughts a little bit about that. Then we are going to, I'm going to mention my view and as I shared with Florin about what we expect to publish in the special issue. Finally, we're going to open for a Q&A. So that's kind of the plan. So let me just, before I turn it over to the panelists for their brief presentation, I would like to just introduce the panelists. The first person who's going to talk is Hervé Stoloui. He is a professor at HSM, and I guess he needs no introduction. He's done a lot, well-established researchers, well-published, primarily in financial accounting, international accounting, harmonization, and more recently have started working on textual analysis. The second presenter is going to be Peter Wysocki, and Peter has worked in many different areas, including international accounting, disclosure, capital market incentives, etc. And he presented this morning a paper that demonstrates building a dictionary that is using regulation words. Our third panelist is going to be Tianyu Zhang from a Chinese University of Hong Kong, and he's done research on institutions and governance, accounting choices, market intermediaries, and he's actually presenting tomorrow a paper where he looks at the political bias and the role of media using 1.8 million newspaper articles from China. So this is the plan for now. I'm going to turn it to Hervé.
Thank you very much, Robbie. So I'm very pleased to be here and to make a presentation. I will try to present the field of textual analysis based on literature review. So first of all, I will quote the main sources that I used to prepare this presentation. If you are familiar with this area, you surely know these articles, but if you are not familiar, I really recommend to start with these articles because they are really excellent. So I have used a very recent literature review written by Loughran and MacDonald, published in JAR 2016. I used a literature review published in Journal of Accounting Literature 2010 by Lee, and also a paper on textual sentiment in finance by Kierney and Liu, published in International Review of Financial Analysis. And the last element that I provide is a link to the Loughran and MacDonald. They have a website where they provide files and Excel files and stats files, including dictionaries. So that's very useful in practice. So the idea is that with textual analysis, we can answer research questions. So we can better analyze text for patterns. So the main idea is can we measure the quantity and quality of information in a text, and can we analyze the intended message but also the unintended message. So can we compute, can we make computations to analyze news articles? I mean, before humans can read and assimilate the information. Can we use these text elements to better provide bankruptcies? I only provide examples. Can we find elements in earnings conference calls, better than can do analysts? So if you take the Loughran and MacDonald paper, you have a long list of research questions. That's really interesting. So why is there a recent move, a recent trend towards textual analysis? Well, we have two answers. First of all, we have, computers, computing power, that's in any field, but also because we have now online availability of material. We have annual reports, news articles, press articles, earnings conference calls. We have SEC filings, that's the filing by the US firms or firms quoted in the US. We have analyst reports, we have comment letters to standard setters, we have text from social media. So nowadays we have material which was not available online until recently for some of these elements. So the problem is there are different types of textual analysis. So I'm almost certain that my colleagues would surely have other typologies in mind. So I use the typology of Loughran and MacDonald in their survey. So they make a difference between readability and other elements. So readability they define as the ability of the reader to decipher, to read, to understand the intended message. And the other elements that I will present very quickly are the idea of extracting meaning from text. We have targeted phrases, sentiment analysis, topic modeling, and document similarity. So readability, I will not make a long literature review. So there are different articles. So one seminal article is the article by Lee, published in JE 2008, on the link between readability and fur performance based on annual reports. And then we have other papers on readability of annual reports or other reports, including analyst reports. So it has been associated with other concepts. I only mention examples. So investor behavior, trading volume, or analyst coverage, paper Lee and Merkley and Tar. So the problem with textual analysis, and I will not enter into that because I know that some of my fellow panelists will mention these issues, but one key issue of textual analysis is measurement, all right? So there are many ways to measure readability. So here I only provide some ideas, some examples. So many measures are based on combination of the idea of sentence length, or syllable-related measures, so the difficulty of some measures. So you have the fog index, you have the Flesch-Kincaid index, you have the Flesch index. So all these measures are try to compute the difficulty to read and to understand some messages. The problem is, as you know, as far as you have the measure will be criticized. So you have criticism of the fog index, and so even in Loughran and MacDonald, you have some suggestion, measures based on the size of the file. So that's one way to measure readability. And Loughran and MacDonald, they present other methods, common word, financial terminology, and vocabulary. So the two slides were about readability. If we go to methods which aim at really analyzing the text, many of these methods are included in a very big category called bag of words. So bag of words means that we really want to compute a measure to understand the meaning of the message. So here the implicit assumption is the order is not so important. We compute the words, okay? We search for the words and we compute the words. So that's why they are called a bag of words measure. So the idea is usually you get a matrix, so you have the words and then you have the word count. So the different methods, we have targeted phrases. So you have words, specific words, and you compute the words or the phrases. And I would say that you have decided the sentence that you search for. Okay, the researcher has decided. Then we have a word list. So word list, we can talk long on that because all these word lists are based on dictionaries. So very famous examples of dictionaries are dictionaries of positive words, dictionaries of negative words, dictionaries of uncertain words. So if you want to use dictionaries, one solution is to go to the website that I showed in the previous slide. Then you have Excel files with these dictionaries. One question with these dictionaries, and which is, I think, still unsolved, is the issue of term weightings, okay? Because in all these dictionaries, all the words have the same weighting. So you have some other more sophisticated methods, one called naive Bayesian methods. You have also thematic structure of documents. So you use a software which will identify the topics. And it's called a latent semantic analysis, LSA. You have latent Dirichlet allocation, LDA. So here, well, one constraint is it works best with large documents. And second, you give the documents to a software, and the software will identify the topics for you. So that's the objective of the method. Then you have document narrative. So that's some other methods where you think that the sequence of words is important. I mean, a sentence is different words, so the order is important. So then, of course, it's harder to analyze with techniques, but in Lockren-McDonald, you have a very, very interesting section where they explain some of concepts which explain how to analyze the real content of the document. So you have some sort of, not conditions, but characteristics of the text. So you have lexical, that text analysis. Co-location means the relationship with other words. So if one word is followed or by another word, so that's collocation. Then you have syntactic, means the grammatical structure of the sentence. Semantic, that's the meaning of the word in the context of the sentence. Pragmatic, so you infer, you guess the meaning based on the words before, preceding and following. And discourse means that you really analyze the content of the word. So that's all the presentation. So in summary, I strongly recommend to refer, if you start in the field, to refer to these articles. And then you'll see that one difficulty and one major difficulty, as you see in practice, is to use software to make these computations, measurements. And then I'm sure that my fellow panelists will mention this issue, we discuss this issue. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Roby as well as the European Accounting Review for the opportunity to present at this forum. So this commentary and this panel discussion, my component of it, I'm going to talk about my personal experiences related to primarily one research paper which I presented earlier today, but another one that goes back quite a few years. So we were asked to discuss in the call textual analysis research related to the quantity and quality of information, as well as the implication for accounting research questions, and then look at specific things related to disclosure, sentiment, similarity, and so on, which pretty much defines textual analysis, and Hervé did a very good job of providing an introduction to some of the technical elements. I'm going to talk a bit more on a personal level related to two research papers, one that I presented this morning, and then one that goes back almost 20 years that got beat up at the time in the review process because they said it wasn't really related to accounting or finance research, but interestingly it seems that the tides have turned. So first of all, I will discuss the things in the call. However, I want to play a little bit of devil's advocate in saying, is this just related to accounting research questions? And like I said, I'll discuss some of the insights I have from my personal experience. So the symposium theme suggests that we should use textual analysis to investigate accounting questions. I would argue, and again, to be a little bit controversial, is that accounting researchers have a first mover advantage and comparative advantage with capabilities and tools to do textual analysis. And probably we can address accounting questions, which the European Accounting Review issue will likely focus on, but I would say let's think more broadly and bigger. We understand disclosures, we understand financial reports, but those tools can be used to understand non-accounting questions or questions that span beyond the boundaries of accounting. And so I would say there's a unique opportunity for us because other fields, as we've seen in finance, that they're moving forward, that we should take advantage of this opportunity to not only do accounting-related research, but related to general business practices and the like, which can be evidenced by the disclosures in financial reports. So again, I would think and suggest that we think beyond accounting, or in addition to accounting, to economics, law, finance, psychology, sociology, computer science, and the like, because we do have unique, specific capabilities and insights in our profession related to textual content. My only experience with textual analysis, and again the specific paper which is titled Which Firms Are Affected by Regulation, uses a measure based on textual analysis from corporate disclosures. What I want to highlight is that we're trying to address not really an accounting question. We're using accounting information, but not really an accounting question. We're asking a question that spans other fields. Ask the question, do regulations affect firms' decisions and corporate policies? But then the question is, how do we measure regulation? And so textual analysis that we used was not the goal of the paper or the primary focus. It was a means to an end to address broader questions that are listed here. And so one thing that I would say is that in this search for understanding corporate behavior, managerial behavior, we can use textual analysis as a tool. And so in this case, why don't we let firms tell us how regulation is affecting them, rather than us saying, oh, we think this firm is regulated? Why don't we let the voluntary and mandated disclosures help us? So what we look at here, it's very, very simple. We're looking for, in our setting, just the use of the term regulation or regulatory or regulated words. And as you can see here, they're frequent, actually much higher frequency than other types of words that we've seen in other studies. And maybe we got lucky, but this is a pretty well-defined term here in how it's used in corporate disclosures. What do we do? And again, it's primarily focused on the quantity, so that's one of the aspects of textual analysis. We're looking at the quantity, so we're looking for the frequency or relative frequency of regulatory words relative to the total volume of disclosure. And then we look at, as Hervé had mentioned, the tone and other things that modify the discussion of regulatory words. We also look for time series similarity. So again, this is similarity measures or boilerplate measures to look at time series variation over time. So just one observation related to that. We thought about how we're going to analyze the text in a report. And one of the things that we did in reading the literature to look for tools is that our, when I say our, my co-author, a former doctoral student, Taylor Wiesen, noted that there seems to be an undue focus on the novelty of the tools and the technology at the expense of addressing the fundamental question. And so in some cases, overly complex computing tools that as an accounting researcher, trying to even understand these things was fairly opaque. And to use an analogy from the analytical literature, there once was a paper, this is 15 years ago, where someone used a supercomputer simulation that took hours and hours on a supercomputer at the time, not hours, days, and they wanted to ask the question, if two people had a pizza, how would you divide it? And they spent, huge amount of resources on a supercomputer to come to the conclusion that two people would split it down the middle. And so that kind of warning, I would say, is equally applies to some of this textual analysis. If you can use simple, intuitive methods that are robust and that other researchers can understand and replicate, my preference is to go along those lines, and that's one of my recommendations. So related to that, there's the working paper back from 1998. We wanted to measure disagreement among investors on these stock message boards in their discussions. And how did we address it? We simply said whether a message generated a response or replies. And if many of you read any discussion forums online, you'll see that generally it's not, if I'm going to comment or reply to your comment, is not right on or you're correct or I agree, it's I disagree. And so that very simple method worked. Interestingly, a few weeks ago I saw a working paper that basically does the exact same thing that I did back in 1998, and the authors were complaining that they lacked financial resources because it required weeks and weeks of supercomputing power to determine, based on textual analysis, whether there's disagreement. And the question is, well, you can simply get that by the response, whether there's a discussion going on. You don't have to look at necessarily spending weeks of computing power and fairly opaque methods to come to that same conclusion. In our paper, going back to this regulation paper, we look at various elements to, again, address the question, how do we measure regulation and what are the impacts? And how is regulation changing over time, given the questions about regulation? And one of the things that is noted here, that many people believe regulation is increasing, and we seem to find that in the data. But one of the things delving deeper is the fact that the composition of the sample of firms, at least in this case in the US economy, has changed over time. So in the top category here, the top two, banking and health, there's a lot more firms in 2013 or recent years that are in regulated type circumstances compared to less regulated firms, business equipment and retail, that have declined over time. And if you look at this analysis, looking at the actual trend and use of regulatory words between 96 and 2013, there's a huge upward trend. But if you do an as-if analysis, that is to say, holding the type of discussions of regulatory words using 1996 values and just change the sample composition, most of the trend is related to changes in the type of firms in the economy rather than necessarily changes in regulation. Another thing that we do in our analysis, again from personal insights, is use of these modifier words to say different types of regulation. And one thing I want to say, which is something to think about, is that we had to create very specific customized list of words that apply to regulation. If we used word lists or dictionaries based on standard things like the Loughran and MacDonald list, we wouldn't have been able to classify or pick up these things. And so that's another thing. What are the tools that one should use? Are they specific to your particular research question and setting, and therefore you create something custom, or do you use generic, generalized lists created by others? I would say you have to face that trade-off of generalizability versus answering specific questions. And so what we use is these specific modifier words related to regulation to look at some time series trends. We also look at the tone, which again is one of the things used in the literature, and we use the Loughran and MacDonald list of positive and negative words and constraint words. And what do we find? We find that firms that use more regulatory words in their reports, that is to say arguably more regulated, tend to have a more negative tone overall in their reports. And also the tone related to their specific discussions of regulation tend to be more negative compared to other discussions in their reports. And we also find that constraint words are more frequent when you discuss regulations. Maybe not surprising, but one of the things as part of this analysis is that we found that a lot of the words in these standardized tone lists or constraint lists didn't apply well to regulation. And so, for example, We wanted to capture the costs or expenses related to regulations. We wanted to capture that variation. But the Loughran and MacDonald word lists do not contain the words cost or expense. And they explained that, they didn't want to pick up parts of cost or expense which are standardized in financial reports. But in this case, their word lists were not useful to us for our particular question. So I would say there's an opportunity here for accounting researchers that we should not let the lead of others in other fields dictate what word lists are, use our specific knowledge and our specific expertise of financial reports to improve upon or create competing word lists that build on our comparative advantage. One of the things that we, again, want to look at is what the implications are or the costs of regulation. And what we did, and we got lucky, was that we looked at Donald Trump's election in November 2013 and said, basically, if this is a regulatory or deregulatory shock, can our measure based on textual analysis differentiate between firms that before the election said they're heavily regulated, and then what would their stock market reaction, which can capture costs or benefits, after the election? And so you can see here that yes, the US stock market went up in the months after the election. Well, what do we find? We use a model of determinants of stock returns over that period, and we find that actually the strongest explanatory variable for cross-sectional variation in returns is whether they were described as being regulated in 2015. And so, interestingly, we can make a connection here between a question we want to address and then the tool that we used. Again, the focus of the paper is not necessarily on using textual analysis, it's answering the question of what are the potential costs of regulation and how to measure it. We do similar things with cross-sectional variation in firm characteristics with regulation and so on. And so just as a summary of my insights, I think there's sort of 5 things that I would say, based on my personal experience in research, is that we as accounting academics have a first mover advantage and unique capabilities and tools. Because again, a lot of teaching, many PhD programs and departments are working on this, and so we have unique tools and capabilities in this area, and we should not only address accounting questions, but ask questions that go into law, economics, and the like, where corporate disclosures can be used. I would say avoid focusing on the novelty of the tools or the overly complex technology. Don't use overly complex computing tools when all you need is to address a simple and intuitive issue. Why, bring a bazooka to an arm wrestle when it's unnecessary? Also, we have opportunities as accounting academics to improve the existing dictionaries based on corporate disclosures, based on our training and knowledge of companies' financial reports. And then finally, as a suggestion to researchers is that, you should trade off the generalizability of the tools, which is whether it's standardized tone measures or standardized dictionaries or word lists, versus using specific or custom methods that are better suited for your particular research question. Thank you.
Yeah, I should thank Hervey introduced the background for this area. And also Peter suggests we do some non-accounting research using this technology, because in my research there are few elements about accounting. So I can go to the new trend. I define this textual analysis as a new trend because according to a paper by Gary King in year 2011 on Science, he started one paper published in Science about 20 years ago. And in that paper, the scientists were asked to make some prediction for the future of their field. You can see what the natural scientists say. They say they can, in the coming 20 years, they can make some breathtaking discovery. They can make some new innovation. They can solve some problem. And they can say some policy or engineering will be available to do something. So, but you look at the social scientists. Of course, there are few social scientists on this list. they say in this article, the social scientists, they do not propose any single problem to be addressed. And also no invention or discovery in the horizon in the coming 20 years. And also what they are saying is we once started this area, and in the future we are going to study that. That's the reality. But however, the social scientists may have underestimate the future because of the onslaught of new social science data, which is so much around in the society. So with all this information, the social scientist can do some research, which is impossible in the old days. So for example, you can see for the criminal analysis, the people can do research based on some survey of the people, or the victim people in some criminal cases. But now you can see you have this camera, have some on-site information collected through some technology. And also you think of the citizen opinion. So in the old days, you can survey maybe 1,000 correspondents, or maybe 10,000. But now you can use 100 millions of social media posts to analyze what's the opinion of the citizen. So, and also there is a, sorry. Also, there is a huge demand for the computational social science. And as we can see, the biology or the physics, they have made a huge progress because they can collect huge data in their area. But for social science, we do not fully utilize data we have. By using one simple example, you can see by year 2008, one researcher analyzed the connection between among the investment banker in the world. And they published this paper in Science. So which means there is a big potential in this area to work on. And for the textual analysis, when we are working in this area, we should follow these 4 principles. This is proposed by a political scientist. So we should make sure, we should have this in our mind. All the quantum model of language are wrong. But some information you extracted through this model are useful. Which means, for example, you can compare these 2 sentences. So when you say the time flies like an arrow, and you compare with another sentence like the fruits flies like a banana. So you cannot expect the computer can tell the difference of flies in these 2 sentences. And also, another principle is any quantum model for text, it will amplify the resources and augment humans, but not replace them. Which means when we do this textual analysis, use this high technology, we must make sure you read the document carefully before you ask the machine to do it. And also, even the result generated by the machine, you should carefully do the double check. And also, there is no globally best method for the automated test analysis. So that means there is no globally well-defined model. So when you go to any specific setting, you should try to identify what's the specific setting you have and modify the model accordingly. And the last principle is validation. Because once you input any data into the computer, he always generates some information for you. Maybe it's garbage or it's information. So then I will share some of my own experience using the textual analysis in China, because I never touch US data. I only touch Chinese. So I have all the media data in China. So I have about 500 gigabyte data with 6 million news articles, corporate news articles from more than 300 newspapers in China, from all around in Chinese from all around the world. We label the sentiment for each sentence in the article, and we are trying to develop this database into a Chinese ribbon pack. So maybe after this June, we will make the data available. So if you have interest in working on China market, you can access this data. So and Pierre Trotsky, Wang, and Zhang, so we use this data to investigate the consequence of media reform in China on the political biases in corporate news. So the paper was very close to the publication in the Journal of Law and Economics, which means no accounting, Peter. And another set of text I'm working on now is the analysis report. So we got more than 200,000 analysis report covering Chinese listed company. So we have this paper working on now. The motivation of the paper is the multinational firms have a liability of foreigners, which means for those multinational companies, when they enter into a new country, so the subunit in this country will copy the model from the headquarters, but they can't compete with the local competitor because of the lack of the institutional knowledge. So we call this as a liability of foreigners. And also this is also true for the analyst, because the financial literature already found the local analysts, they do have information advantage. So in this paper, what we are trying to do is where do the analysts, the local analysts, derive their information advantage? Is the institutional knowledge in politics in China? So that's the research question we are trying to address in this paper. So what we are doing, using this 200,000 research report, so we use this LDA technique to map this each report into 1,000 topics, which means each report will be mapped into 1,000 topics with different weight on each topic. And based on the word cluster of top 50 words generated by the LDA, we manually label the topics into different three categories. One is the political topics, and the second one is the financial topics. And the remaining will be classified as all others. Then that's the example for the two topics from a political topic and the financial topics. So when we look at the difference of the weight put on different topics by different analysts, and our finding here is you can see the local analysts put a lot of weight on the policy or the politics in China when they are analyze the firms they are following. But you can see the foreign analysts, they focus more on the financial ratio analysis, which means they are familiar with this technology when they are working on the Wall Street. When they come to China, they simply borrow this knowledge here to the emerging market. But in China or in maybe some other emerging market, the politics or the policy may be the first order effect driving the operation of the company. So that means you can see the local analysts have this advantage. So they rely on this knowledge, so they can the forecast performance is also much better. So which was shown in the paper. We are not present the result here. And also another experience I'm working on is I look into the social network in the business and the politics. So what I have now is I have more than 100,000 CV of the management of the Chinese listed companies between 1999 to 2013. And also, I have the CV for 5,000 politicians since the foundation of the country. So using this data, I can identify the social network of these managers in the business world and the political world. But before doing that, I construct this political faction in China and investigate how the affiliation of the faction will affect the political movement or firms in the faction. So how to define the faction? So we define the faction in this way. Because we have all the central politicians in China, so according to the CV, we can identify which politician is connected with the other one. So we can define this close community for the central politician as a faction, which means through this technology we can identify this all the politicians in this cluster will be connected with each other. When surrounding this central faction, we fit the local politician to each faction, and then we fit the firms with connection with any politician in the faction into each faction. So that's what we are doing, which means now we define this political faction, and all firms are linked to each faction. And according to the finance literature so far, the firms with have this common connection. So the co-movement of the stock price should be higher. Like for the GF paper in year 2014, so if the firms was under common ownership by the fund, the price co-moves more. And also another paper in GFE, if the firms have a common owner or the interlocked director, the price of the company will co-move. So according to this finding, our prediction here maybe is the firms in the same firm, in the same faction, should also have a higher price co-movement. That's our expectation. But however, when we look into the data, our finding here is if two firms in the same faction, the co-movement of stock price is even lower. So this is a surprise to us. So then we go through the literature of the political science, trying to find out what's the explanation for this result. So we go to this management cartoon. You can see the company is like a tree, so full of monkeys on the tree. So you can see some monkey climbing up, some monkey climbing down. So the monkey on the top, when he look downward, he see many smiling faces. But for the monkeys at the bottom looks up, he see something ugly. And even in China, we have this saying: see, if you look around, you see eyes and ears. Who is spying on you? So this is also true for the political cadre system in China. So which means that in this political hierarchy, the politicians may also compete with each other. So that's our conjecture. So when we look into more details, see, if the firms are connected with the same politician, which means there is no competition. There should be cooperation here because the firms now is linked to the same politician. And our finding here, then you can see in the same faction, the co-movement is lower, but once you connect with the same politician, the co-movement is higher, which means there is in this political cadre system, there is a competition among the politicians. That's the finding of the paper. So we have many more designs to look into the difference of the competition. The results are consistent with our argument. And also, I have some other data to share with you. I have the social media data, which is about 10 TB. We have the data from two very famous stock BBS in China. So we can identify all the posts about each specific company. We are working on this to look into how this as an informal information channel in the market. And also we have the People's Daily. So that's the masterpiece newspaper from the CCP. So we have all the newspaper from the foundation of the country until now. And we have the post of the VIPs on the WeChat and the Weibo, which is the Chinese Twitter. So that's the most popular social media in China. So we are still working on this. So my conclusion here is a lot of fun working in this area in China because you can look into some research questions you can never imagine before. So that's my talk. Thank you.
Okay, so as the last person on the panel, my plan for the next 15 or 20 minutes is to share with you two examples of applying what I call a new and an existing textual analysis methods to two existing research questions, attempting to shed new light using these new tools. And then I'm going to conclude with some details on the special issue, our expectations, and some other details related to that. And then we're going to talk about the Q&A. The first example I would like to share with you is taken from a paper that I've written with several co-authors, Ellen Huang and Emmy Zhang and Rong Zhang. Ellen is actually here in the crowd, in the audience. It's titled Analyst Information Discovery and Information Interpretation Roles, a Topic Modeling Approach. And just as a quick side story, the paper was actually submitted and accepted for the EAA conference. And then we got the good news that it was accepted for publication in Management Science, followed by a week later by an email from the EAA committee that now we can no longer present the paper here. But I assured Ellen that there's always a back door to, get it in front of people here. So just as a kind of a few words about the paper and how it relates to what I think Florian and I envisioned for some of the papers that we would like to publish along with Hervé in the special issue. The background is fairly straightforward. I've been doing a lot of research as sell-side analyst, and Amy and Ellen and Ron has done the same. It's not a secret that analysts are information intermediaries. They provide information to capital market participants, and the literature have talked about them doing particularly sort of two things. They discover information by providing private research, and then they also interpret existing information to help investors and other constituents understand sort of what's going on. For years, actually, I've been sort of looking at that particular kind of dichotomy, and I said, I think we know that they do both. That was not the issue. But how much of each they actually do and under what circumstances? What drives them to engage in a particular type of activity, the discovery or the interpretation versus sort of the other one? So there is some evidence that they both exist. That is not the really interesting questions, but what's going on? When they engage in what do they do, and what drives each of their roles? So they warned me about that thing. Okay, here we go. So we go into the paper and we say, here are a couple of things we would like to do. The first thing, what if we can actually explicitly identify what the information content in an analysis report, specifically what they say in the report without reference to stock prices. One of our co-authors is actually a professor at the School of Information. And if you ask people outside of accounting, as Peter was alluding to, reaching out to other fields, you ask them about information content, their first reaction is not going to be, look at the market reaction. Some of them, are not really connected to capital markets. So can we come up with a pure measure of what is the content of an information without judging it from a potentially problematic investor reaction? The second thing, can we examine cross-sectionally the circumstances where they engage in each, again, without assuming, without interpreting from market reaction. And then number three, which has never been done in this particular area, is look at investors' reaction, and can we quantify how they simultaneously respond to each of analysts' information roles. So we reach out, and I think this paper was among the first papers that actually used the LDA, the latent Dirichlet allocation, which Hervé mentioned in his discussion. And it's a powerful algorithm that allows you, and Tianyu mentioned that as well, allows you to reduce dimensionality. Essentially, you can think about it as taking large quantities of text and finding some cluster analysis, putting the text in buckets of topics or principal component analysis applied to textual data. Now, this exists, has been in other fields, for instance, at least since 2003, in different variations, has been used in other fields other than accounting and finance. The idea is pretty simple here. The algorithm mimics an author who would like to write a document, and the author presumably goes and chooses the topics from a distribution of topics. And then, given a topic, the author chooses the words from a distribution of words that apply to this particular topic. So this is kind of conceptually you can think how you can think about LDA. It spits out at the end some distribution of topics for each document, and then for each topic it tells you the word frequency, the distribution of words within each document. So we run this analysis on the sample of analyst reports as well as conference call. I'll get to it in a second. Some of the desirable features of this particular method that we like. Unsupervised, we don't need to engage any RAs actually interpreting the information for us. Topics are generated automatically and can handle a massive amount of data. They are interpretable and extremely validated in various fields. I'm going to come back to the validation point because Tianyu mentioned the validate, and I strongly believe that that's going to be one of the features we're going to be looking for when you submit your papers to the special issue, that it's actually validated in the context of your accounting or finance-related question. It provides you a strict measure of information content without reference to market price, and we do it relative to the earnings conference calls. And then, as I mentioned before, it allows you to quantify what texts say and not just how we say that. Personally, I think that the literature has progressed in some kind of a reverse order. We started, or maybe the modern kind of research now in the last few years, is about how texts are being said. Foggy or uncertain, or all sorts of features that tells you how the texts are being said. And many of you know I worked with Fang Li for several years in Michigan before he left, and I used to ask him, it's great that we know that the text is foggy, but what do they actually talk about? I said, I can't tell you what they talk about, I can tell you how they talk about it. So to me, it would make sense to first quantify, identify, and explicitly investigate what they say, and then move to how they say it. And this particular example allows us to do that. In terms of the validation, one thing that I think Florian and Arven are going to be looking for is things that actually support the use of a particular tool in the context of your study. There are lots of other tools out there, but you have to convince us and the referees that it's actually the right thing to do. Part of it is validation. So for example, with the LDA, you may or may not be able to see all of that, it's in the paper, we just looked at the topics that are generated for the capital goods industry and the energy industry. And we actually read the output and say, yeah, that actually makes kind of sense. You can see that there is defense contracts for capital goods, there's offshore drilling topic for the energy. So that sort of satisfies some of it. We do a lot of other different things. One of my favorite validation tests for the LDA use in the context of analyst report is looking at the temporal variation in the distribution of topics within the banking industry. So this is a very colorful chart that I actually like a lot. You can see here the distribution of topics for the banking sector from 2002 or 3 to 2012, and the black line is just the XLF, which is the stock index for the banking sector. You can see that at the beginning, on the left side, at the beginning of the period, they talk more about growth. That would be the red bar. A lot of discussion about growth, and if you go all the way up, not much about deteriorating financial performance, which would be the green. As you move over to the right side of the chart, you can see that growth, or in the middle actually, when the financial meltdown happened for the banking industry, not much discussion about growth or any of that kind of thing. You can see the second one, the red bar, which talks about real estate loans kind of expanding. And then one of the most interesting features, all the way in the top, the purple bar, which talks about equity issuance, TARP, that topic gets a much higher proportion. So this is, before we even started to investigate our research question, we made sure that we actually understand the output of the machine. In terms of what we do, we look at information discovery and we compare what analysts say to what management say in a conference call. And if they talk about topics that management did not talk about, we call it information discovery. They interpret information when, for example, management talk about growth opportunities, analysts also talk about growth opportunities. The same topics overlap, but analysts using different words to describe the same topic. And notice again that there's no sort of market or investors kind of involved in this right now. Main findings, as expected, analysts do engage in discovery and interpretation. That should not come as a surprise. They engage in more discovery when there is higher level of competition, more litigation risk, and firms operate in more volatile information environment. These are proxies for proprietary cost, management incentive to withhold information. Interpretation, when they use more uncertain, qualitative words, when the operations of the firms are more complex, and when they have more... So basically, when management has sort of some incentive or they obfuscate the information, analysts step up and say, we're going to help you, investors and other constituencies, to interpret the information. And then finally, which I think it's a very nice result, and I like it a lot, that investors actually react to both discovery and interpretation as a function of these cross-sectional characteristics. So that's sort of the first example that I would like to give you, taking an existing question and applying sort of a new method to understanding and improving upon some of the existing analysis. The second quick example is from a paper that is still a working paper with two of my colleagues, Jason Chan and Itai Kama, the tone of management forward-looking statements and asymmetric cost behavior. So what we did here, we try to combine an existing method, the tone of management FLS, existing method from mainly financial accounting, with a question that has been investigated quite heavily in managerial accounting. And that's another thing that I'm going to encourage a lot of you to do. I'm going to be certainly very open to accepting papers like that, that you take your textual tool and apply it to other things other than just like mainstream financial issues. It could be managerial, it could be tax accounting, it could be auditing, governance, compensation. Reach out to anything that interests us as accountants, but interests, as Peter was saying, other people outside of accounting. And so what we do here, we look at the large literature of asymmetric cost behavior, and many of you probably know that. I'm not going to mention the whole thing. There's the notion that costs behave or respond asymmetrically to increase and decrease in sales, the notion of sticky cost and anti-sticky cost. The thing that actually, and that's Itai has done some work on that. And I came in and say, so what explains that? It's, well, people say that management have some expectations on whether the future is going to be positive or negative, and that determines how they respond and how they change cost. And that was sort of a big discovery in this particular literature, that management makes deliberate decisions to either increase or maintain some of their resources in response to change in sales. And underlying these resource allocation decisions are expectations regarding future demand. It turns out that there's one other paper that actually look at a combined measure of expectations, but we believe we can identify explicitly those expectations and sort of bring it into the managerial accounting literature specifically with these questions. So we come in and say, well, can we actually isolate expectations and link it to this existing phenomenon of asymmetric cost behavior? And then we do some cross-section looking at when do expectations matter? And that's another thing that at least I think Florian and I are going to be looking for when you submit your papers. A lot of sort of interesting cross-sectional variation tests, kind of see exactly when things matter, when things don't matter. They don't have to always matter. So expectation may or may not matter depending on, for example here, the amount of unutilized resources or the adjustment cost of the particular cost structure of the firm. The measure, nothing new. It's the same old tone, the forward-looking state, the tone of the forward-looking statements in MD&A. And some of the panelists mentioned the notion of tone and the dictionaries. I just came from the NCAD conference and I saw a paper presented that looks at the extremity, how extreme is the tone. So people are taking these two buckets of positive and negative tone and are making it more of a continuous measure, the most extreme positive and the least extreme, and the most extreme negative. So things are sort of progressing, things are moving along. And the only one thing I'm going to show you, we run this basic regression. We have the change in cost on the left-hand side, run on the change in revenues, and then the beta 2 times the rev dec. That's your measure of asymmetric cost reaction to changes in the revenues. The one thing that I think nicely validates and sort of confirms what people have said in the literature, if you look at this figure, the horizontal bar is the horizontal axis is the FLS tone quintile. So on the bottom here you go from the most negative to the most positive tone, and this, to me at least, is very convincing that as the manager's expectations become more and more positive as you move to the right, you can see that the extent of the asymmetric cost behaviors is increasing monotonically. So for example, if you go to the most pessimistic tone, the management, the degree of the asymmetry is going to be the negative 0.16 all the way down to negative 0.34. And I think this, at least to us, provide a very strong validation of the ability of the tone of the FLS to actually explain something in this other literature. We do a bunch of other things cross-sectionally that validates and tests our hypothesis in this particular context. So the lesson from this to the special issue is that yes, we will actually be looking for linking the tools, new tools, existing tools, with questions that are seemingly separate from the financial, the mainstream, maybe something from managerial, as I said, from text, or from auditing, or any other areas of research. So these are the two examples that I wanted to provide. In terms of the special issue, and Peter had some of it on his slides, the aim is to advance the use of textual analysis, look at the quantity and quality of information provided by financial disclosures and any other type of disclosure that are related to what we care about, broadly speaking. The deadline for the submission is November 30th of 2017, so there's still plenty of time to write the papers before the deadline. The call for papers mentioned some topics that are appropriate for this issue, not limited to, of course. Drivers of textual disclosure. So any kind of property that you think you deem is appropriate, I'm at least going to be interested in looking at that. It could be, fogginess, uncertainty, sentiment, extreme language, and what drives managers to use particular linguistic features depending on other circumstances they may be facing. Second one, information content. I think this is a particular area that you can investigate and add a lot of contribution to the information content of the textual disclosures with respect to a variety of different market variables. You can think about debt, securities, equity, cost of capital, anything that you can come up with. Do constituents out there, investors, bankers, lenders, find it useful, find the text useful? The third is the ability of textual disclosure to predict future performance or firms' decisions. I think it's going to be important as part of the validation and part of your hypothesis to actually demonstrate that both independently and incrementally, and some of the panelists were alluding to that, it's not just enough, it's not enough to show that a particular tool actually works. It has to be incremental to what we already know in this particular area. I think that's going to be important. And if it does contribute over and above existing, perhaps textual measures, that's going to be important to know. The next one is going to be the effect of textual information on market intermediaries. Lots of intermediaries out there, right? So people now focusing a lot on stock analysts, less on rating agencies. There is a few papers on media, but people who actually use the financial disclosures absolutely look at this as part of the topics that you may consider for the conference. Managerial incentives. You can look at psychological biases, you can look at attribution biases, you can look at how they use it as part of compensation incentives, reputation incentives, meet or beat incentives. How did they harness the power of the words to achieve their goals, opportunistic or not, whatever have you. Next, implications of differences in characteristics of cross-country textual information. So Tianyu is focusing a lot on China, which is great. A harder challenge is to look at, for example, cross-listed firms, firms who report in different languages. So one thing I can think in the context of the data that you have, now that you have a Chinese or ability to analyze Chinese language, is looking at firms that report in multiple languages. How do cultural differences shape the information that we get from these firms? I think this is actually very interesting to me. I haven't been able to do anything about this yet because it's hard to find those cross-country and dictionaries, but I think that's certainly something we can look into. A couple of other things, regulatory requirements, how textual analysis help meet regulatory requirements, and finally how the textual disclosures vary across industries, time periods, and firm characteristics. And the panelists have shown some examples of the cross-sectional variation that again helps us understand the power of the words and how they're being used in the context of issues that interest us as accounting researchers. So these are the 4 presentations that we had prepared for this particular symposium, and I would now like to turn into the Q&A, so I'm going to go back there and we're going to take questions from the audience. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Umayma Hassan. I have a few questions, if you can allow me to. Okay, for the first presenter, please. Why is the sudden interest in textual analysis if it has been going on since the late 1960s? The second one is about the focus on validity. You're giving me the impression that you are focusing on machine coding in contrast to human coding. Why is that? The third one is about the call for research. Is it open to ready-made measures for textual information, or is it only for research or self-constructed measures? Thank you.
So your first question was about the growing interest on textual. Yes, okay. So the recent trend, even though I agree that there are some older research on textual analysis, there is still a rather recent trend, and the recent trend is based on two phenomena. The first one is computing skills. All right, because as you've seen, I mean, I'm really impressed by your papers and your research, because the data used, I mean, is so big that you really need some computing skills. And the second one is really availability of material. Because, of course, the SEC filings have been available for some time, but social media phenomenon is rather recent, okay? And conference calls transcripts are now available. They were not available many years ago. So nowadays you have some material which was not available in the past. So that's the interpretation, that's the explanation for the recent and growing trend in textual analysis.
Thank you. So it is driven by advances in computer science. It is driven by advances in computers. So we can use computers for textual.
I mean, it's two things. It's computers and availability of material, because I mean, without the material, you can have the best computers in the world, you do nothing. So it's really the conjunction of the two phenomena which creates now the possibility to do some very rich and very interesting textual analysis.
Yeah. Thank you. About the second one, please, about the validity of the measure.
So is the question, why do we care so much about validity?
Validity only. You didn't talk at all about the reliability of the measure, which gave me the impression that you are concerned with machine coding rather than human coding.
No, these are all, at the end of the day, joint measures, right? I mean, we have to validate. Part of the hypothesis is the validation.
Yeah.
But a lot of them are new to us. There are things we use for the first time in the context of existing questions. At the time, you look at the discretionary accruals measures, people wanted validation. Now you don't have to do it anymore. So as a first step, I think part of the burden is on us using those new tools is to demonstrate that they actually capture what we think they capture. You can call it validity, you can call it reliability, you can call it appropriateness. As some of the other panelists said, it's not about bringing a tool and looking for a question. Obviously, think about the question and then pick and choose from a menu of different tools that are appropriate. Now, it could be that textual analysis may not be an appropriate tool for what you do, but if it is, and if it's something we're not familiar with, I think the burden is on the researcher to convince obviously the reviewers, but the profession as a whole, that first of all, they actually work in the context of what we do. If you think about the tone dictionary that was mentioned here, before McDonald Lockhart developed their measure, we used to use other measures like the Harvard, the GI measure. Now, this thing did not have the word downgrade as a negative word. So it was not appropriate, for example, to use in the context of what we do. And therefore, we had to create other more appropriate dictionaries that apply to the questions that interest us. So I think this is, for now at least, is going to be hand in hand until these measures become acceptable. Now, if you look at the LDA, the topic modeling, I think the first few papers I know we had to go through a lot of hoops to validate it and to show in different, before we even got to the research questions.
Yes.
And then show that. I think the future papers may not need to do as much.
This is because it was machine coding, isn't it? Because if it's a human coding, you have to produce evidence that they are replicable.
No, human suffers from biases too. Humans are not perfect. It actually may be better that it was not human coding. It was actually machine coding. At least we know what the machine is doing, right? So there are always trade-offs. There are always benefits and advantages.
Yeah.
And disadvantages.
For my last one for you as well, sir, about are you open for ready-made measures for textual analysis?
A ready-made.
Yes, we have, for example, Bloomberg ready-made measure of disclosure for environmental, governmental issues. So are you open for this kind of measures or only researcher constructed measures?
I find this whole area very, very exciting. So I'm open to a lot of different things in this particular area of research. In this particular example, the Bloomberg, we would expect you to understand that it's not a black box and understand what it does, how it's constructed the best you can. And then because you did not construct it, to show that it actually applies before you even start to do your stuff. So that would be the reliability validation.
And validity, yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks. Just a question to maybe Robbie and Peter. I think these were two completely different perspectives. One of them was like use simple things, don't use a bazooka, and then Robbie used the much more advanced techniques. I mean, pardon the expression advanced. I mean maybe more computer intensive techniques, right? So how much do you think, I mean, that we lose if we use maybe a simple one? Do we introduce more noise maybe in measurement, or is it maybe more appropriate for different research questions? And then maybe to Robbie, I mean, well, how much does that factor in to your maybe, you know, view of the papers, I mean, that will be submitted to EAR? I mean, do we really need to, for example, focus on the techniques, I mean, and say these are, you know, more advanced techniques or more complex techniques in order to, when we submit papers to for the special issue, or is it, or can we just say, well, we are using, you know, simple technique because it may be sufficient or appropriate for the research question?
I think we can really draw analogies from other streams of research in accounting or even other fields and what the progression is. So it's not as if textual analysis is totally alien to us as a methodology. Think of other methodologies in the progression and what the trade-offs are. If you think regular financial accounting models, there's the trade-off between complexity and simplicity and intuition, others being able to replicate it. So, you know, one perspective is to be entirely somewhat self-serving as an author, or as any author, is you want people to cite your work. And if you're doing something that is either difficult to replicate or difficult to understand, people may not use it. So again, if you think of the example of discretionary accruals models, there's plenty of them out there that have existed over the history of investigations of accruals, yet some of the simplest ones seem to persist, have the most intuition, and maybe are likely to be the most robust. So I don't think there's anything unique to textual analysis when it comes to measures or methodologies. There's always those trade-offs. I would say, especially for a new field, given that the profession itself is slowly starting to adopt them in the interest of having this as a tool to use, I think making it as transparent, as usable, as intuitive as possible, I think is advantageous for the start of where we're going.
So the cost of a bazooka has gone down a lot over the last few years, and if it's almost the cost of whatever the opposite of a bazooka, using Peter's analogy. So it's a little easier now to harness those seemingly complicated methodologies to answer questions that, you know, you may or may not, you may be able to do it differently, but why not if you can? And it's not that expensive in time and the computing power to do that. But what Florin, and I'm speaking for Florin, I hope you agree with me, what we're going to be looking for is first of all, a question that is important, that is interesting, and a tool, and then find from the shelf, of the different tools that we have, find the right one that is appropriate. Now, we have to reach out to a School of Information, to linguistics. They have been doing a lot of different things that we're not aware of. So tie the tool. Now, if the tool is complicated initially, so be it, but convince us that that's the most appropriate thing to do, and it's not the case that you can just count the number of words and you get away with it. But word count is okay, right? So if you count regulatory words and you construct a dictionary like that, it's fine. If you construct a dictionary like the paper I saw a few days ago on extreme words, by using the Amazon Turk survey, that is okay too, because we learn something, we advance. So the goal is not, the sophistication of the tool is not going to be as crucial, I think, to us, but the appropriateness of the tool to the question, and then demonstrate that actually you think, that you get what you think that you're getting. So I think, we probably agree at the end of the day on how to do it. Which angle you come from may differ, of course. Yeah. Absolutely.
I would like to add something. I fully agree that nowadays the tools are easier to implement, even though it's not so simple, because for those who have heard the name Python and this type of software, it's not user-friendly at all. But to answer your question, I would like to illustrate with a current paper that I have. Tomorrow morning I will present. We analyze press releases. We analyze the wording of press releases, and specifically we look at the words which are related to 6 categories we have designed of intangibles. Okay? So I have presented this paper several times, and we have built a dictionary exactly as Peter has done. So we have our 6 categories and dictionaries. When I presented the paper recently, I had a comment, why don't you use the ADA? Okay? So I knew the principle. I was not really familiar with ADA. I never used it personally. So when I went back to Paris, I looked, ADA, what is it exactly? I've read some papers. And the conclusion is, we still believe, the authors, we believe that's absolutely irrelevant for our research question, because we are not interested at all in general in the topics of the press releases. It's acquisitions press releases. That's not our research question. Our research question is based on some categories, on some words that we have designed. So we can be criticized about our choice, about the categories. Okay, so just to answer that, I think that the research question, and we all have said that, and so the research question, I think, is the most important, and we must use the tool which fits with the research question, not any tool because it's a nice technology.
Maria Dybel from the University of Sydney. Really fascinated with your discussion today, and I'd just like to comment on what was said. If you can do it, why not? I think was what was said, and the power of computing has actually allowed us, as you said, to do a lot more with textual analysis. Suppose my question is about the reliability of your data source. In particular, if I'm looking at social media, how reliable it is to actually believe what is said through social media. I know for a fact, my children do Facebook, and they project something that they want the world to believe, but not necessarily completely, devoid, or separate from what the reality is. So, and I'm wondering, because in the last presentation, I think there was a purpose for all of this, to understand behavior, I thought that's what I heard, and to predict. But I think that rests on a grand assumption that you can actually rely on the information that's being provided and then use that to predict And so it's almost like you're creating a different, if you trust that information, then you're creating a new world almost, yeah? You're almost like determining how, future behavior of people because you're using it to predict. So I'm just a bit concerned about the data source and whether you can actually rely on it, especially with social media. It doesn't matter how voluminous it is, but if it's in inverted comma fake news, then you're actually creating a totally different world by using it to predict behavior. You know what I'm getting at here? It's like creating a monster almost. So I just wondered what the purpose of all this. Sure, you can do it. You've got computing technology to do all of this analysis, but my question in the end is what for?
Well, in some ways, I think the point of we as a collective community of researchers is to understand and, in the case of empirical research, validate phenomena out there. So I think ultimately what you're stating there is it's an empirical question whether the data have association with other things that we observe in the world. Whether it's causal or otherwise, it can be further explored, but it's an empirical question. So the question is it valid? Is it correlated with people's actions? It's an empirical measure, empirical question. So I would say possibly. I think, it's a very positivist view of things that, if this phenomena exists, or if this data exists, empirically, is it correlated?
I'll attend you because you actually work with social media data.
So actually, for the scenario you are telling us just now, I don't think it's a cost to apply this textual analysis to do the research. Actually, I see a lot of opportunity there. Like you can see in the social media, it's another informal information channel. We don't know how this information channel influences the information dissemination in the market. And also you can see some other situation like you see the children may fake some news on Facebook. Also some people make some rumor on this social media about the company. But then you can identify how this rumor influence the company and how the company respond to these rumors. So I think in this situation you can see it depends on how you look at the situation. So you can see do some more research on to understand this platform very well.
Concern is that, there is a tendency to use this just based on what has happened in the past, to use this kind of analysis to create algorithms, yes, that will then predict, that will then determine how people behave in the future. I suppose it's, it's fascinating, but it's potentially dangerous.
Yeah.
That's all.
And
Because
part
there's we're looking at creating algorithms and eventually we predict and then we behave, and so we're just, that's all.
No, just as a final sort of a quick answer to this question. It's a very good question, and we're going to be very, we're going to be looking at as you said, the reliability of the data source, especially data sources we don't understand as well. I think if you look at the 10K components, you're probably going to be good with that, right? I see you nodding, so you're fine. As you venture out, and there's some allegation of manipulation of social media in the press, right? So how that works. Peter was saying, yes, it's an empirical question, and I think as we do more research on that, the fact of life is now we do have the capability to harness the information that is in words, in our text, in stuff that we do that we didn't really have before. It existed in other fields. We're sort of importing all of that stuff to what we do. And we have to be very careful in how we draw conclusions, how we make decisions off of that. And potentially when they started CompuStat, you could have asked the same question many years ago. How can you rely on all that stuff? Firms manipulate their earnings, How do you know that the data you get on CompuStat is reliable? Years of research have done that. Now we have the tools, we have the data, as Alve was saying earlier. And I think as far as I'm concerned with the special issue, this is going to be a challenge for us as we receive those papers to distinguish between databases or datasets that are less reliable and what the authors have done to make sure they are reliable. The word reliability came up before. And then once we're convinced, then we move on to actually the research question, the predictability, making sure we're not creating a monster, as in using your words. And then the authors will have the final judgment. I'm sorry, the readers will have the final judgment on whether they like or not like the conclusion.
Just one follow-up to that is, I think you can think about the accruals model and the accruals anomaly as maybe not potentially as destructive. So should it be the case that Richard Sloan found the accruals anomaly and that it found out that firms can trick investors by manipulating their accruals, and that's what the data seem to show? Well, the benefit of making that public is that people were informed of this, and then you have informed investors making use of this information, and the evidence is suggestive, at least, if not indicating that the accruals anomaly no longer works, that people or investors are no longer fooled by that. So in fact, if you spin it on its head and if you think about the robustness of human beings, in this case investors, it's not making this information public led to more bad behavior on the part of firms. The phenomena went away because this publication of this phenomena actually led to more informed investment decisions, not less.
Okay, we'll take one final question.
Thanks very much, Eugene Novak, Charles University in Prague. Thanks for a very insightful discussion. Maybe is there some kind of research on textual analysis that you would not like to see? Should we be careful about jumping on some sorry. So one more time. Thanks for a very insightful discussion. Eugene Novak, Charles University in Prague. Is there any kind of research in textual analysis you would not like to see, something you would warn us against? I understand that we shouldn't be using bazookas to measure something really simple. I understand that we should have the research question that is relevant for textual analysis. But is there some other sort of criteria, some other kind of research that you would warn us against? Thanks.
That's a loaded question, I guess. I think the one thing I'm going to say, and we're running against time here, I think it's going to be challenging for us to accept papers that look and reach out to a textual methodology and just find the questions that could potentially be addressed by this. So going the other way. So and that's a danger that we have seen. You go in SSR and you see we found this really cool method and we can, and just because we can, we're going to just line up something and test it. I think that's going to be more challenging to get through the process. So it has to be positioned in the context of sort of an economically motivated question and then choose the appropriate tool. But there's no textual tool that I'm aware of that is frowned upon or I'm against it. It has to match the question. So this marriage of the question and the tool, we're going to be very particular about that. Okay. Thank you very much for attending.